Good evening. I'm Michael Lowe here with Civil Discourses, filling in for Megan. We have a great show today. We have Professor Forrest Nabors to my right and Assemblyman Forrest Dunbar to my left. We got the battle of the Forrests. So we'll just start out with quick bios, guys. Start with probably you, Forrest Dunbar.
Okay.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Let's call him FD.
Yeah. I grew up in rural Alaska in a town called Eagle on the Yukon, and then Cordova on Prince William Sound. Went back east for school, went to American University, and then got an MPP and a JD over there. Served in the Peace Corps, and then came back here, and I work as an attorney for Chugach Native Corporation now. Also serve, as you do, in the Army Guard, where I'm a judge advocate, and then finally I'm on the Anchorage Assembly.
Nice.
My parents are Miriam and Roger Dunbar.
Nice. Give a good shout out to the parents. I like it. All right. How about you, Dr. Nabors? Spoke with you the other day, but why don't you tell people?
I don't know if I can measure up to that very brief, but powerful resume. Well, I grew up in New Jersey, in the New York City area, and went out to Claremont McKenna College. And then I took a year off and I was a shepherd in New Zealand.
Nice.
And then I came back and played football for Claremont. And then I decided that I wanted to go to the intellectual Disneyland of America. So I transferred to the University of Chicago.
Where fun goes to die.
Exactly. Fun does go to die there. And actually the social center of the University of Chicago is, guess, the library. The library.
It's like the Milton Friedman
Yeah,
Center.
it's probably the only college or university in America. So anyway, I went into business. After that, I was in high tech. I ended up in the Silicon Forest in Oregon. I had been bitten by the book bug at an early age, so I decided to leave right when my business career was taking off and go back to graduate school, get a doctorate, become a professor, which landed me here. I got my PhD at the University of Oregon and been here since 2011. Love it here and wish I could stay for the rest of my career.
Maybe you can.
I don't know, given what's going on. But you're
very
going to
much
help me out.
dependent. Yeah, very much dependent on what happens with the university budget, I would assume.
Oh yeah. We'll talk about that.
Right.
The reason I want to get both of you guys here because I think that you guys have very good perspectives and very different perspectives on a lot of things that's happening in Alaska and in the national political scene right now. And the first one we'll talk about is the BP Hillcourt deal in Alaska and how us being a kind of a dependent on oil makes us vulnerable towards its downturns. What can we do to diversify Alaska's economy, if anything? And what do you make of the BP Hillcourt deal and Alaska's economic future? Start with you.
I want to hear from him first. You start.
Well, I'll start by saying I don't have any particular inside knowledge on the deal between Hillcourt and BP. In one way, it's sort of encouraging that another company would be willing to buy these assets for several $billions, right? And Hillcourt thinks they can come in here and extract more money from these legacy fields. They can do a better job than BP does. And their business model is quite a bit different. I think it's also worrisome, obviously, for Alaska because it's going to mean a number of layoffs. And BP has been a really important partner for a lot of people in our community. They've done a lot of charitable work. And the question is whether or not Hillcourt is going to continue with that. But that's kind of the micro level. I'd say on the macro level, what you said is absolutely true, which is we've long recognized that our economy is too dependent on oil and on certain extractive industries in general. And I don't think this is actually a controversial statement. I mean, I don't know. You said we're going to have disagreements. I'm not sure if we will.
Maybe a little bit further down.
The question
So far, so good.
Yeah, the question of diversifying Alaska's economy has been sort of the, what do we call it, the silver bullet, golden bullet, whatever it is. It's been the focus for a lot of Alaskans for 40 years, but no one has really hit on one thing. And I think what people have realized, policymakers have realized, is that there isn't one thing. There's no one single thing that can replace the oil industry.
Sure.
In terms of revenue for the state or even jobs for the state's residents. So I think it's going to be a combination of things. I think it's going to be tech, I think it's going to be services, I think it's going to be tourism, I think it's going to be continued sustainable fisheries, that kind of thing. But the other question we need to answer it's not just about the jobs, it's also about revenue for the state, right? Because the state itself provides a lot of middle-class jobs in Alaska. And so far, our tax system is structured so only the oil industry has really been paying a significant portion of taxes. And that is going to have to change. Maybe not this year, but at some point in the not too distant future, we're going to have to diversify our revenue sources if we want to maintain a middle class and have a diversified economy.
Okay.
Mm. Yeah, well, I don't really have any unique insights on the Hillcourt deal, but it does. If the press, I'm remembering the press accounts correctly, most of their, how much of their employee force is in Alaska nationally? I think it's a majority, isn't it, or no?
Well, maybe nationally. So my understanding with Hillcourt is unlike BP that has a bunch of plays going at once. Yeah. Hillcourt kind of focuses on one. I think the last one was in Papua New Guinea, and they're based out of Texas. Right. But it might be the case that I think Alaska is their next big play, and it will be sort of the primary focus of their company.
Yeah, I mean, when I read about it, my hope was, well, maybe the headquarters, or at least the virtual headquarters of the company, is going to move to Alaska, which would be good for the state. Better than having Houston or London, sucking money out of the state like they've been doing for a while. So, I mean, almost everything that you said, I would agree with. That, I mean, in a way, I don't like to demonize oil companies. There are neighbors, the people who work for them are our friends, neighbors, good citizens. The companies have contributed a lot to the state. Nevertheless, I do think, in a way, if you think about it dispassionately, I mean, oil in a way has been a curse of the state. It has been a curse, and in this sense, and I don't mean generally, but in the sense that, because it has biased reinvestment of finance and human capital towards it, it has meant that finance capital and human assets have not been invested in other new sectors of the economy that could have taken root and grown here. But this is what oil does all over the world. Right. See, because it's such a rich resource, you see when it's discovered in nations, it becomes a single resource economy practically, and it dominates everything else. And in a way, when you look at their economies, it kind of curses them in that sense as well. It's hard to have a diversified economy when you've got oil in your midst. So the question is, how do you do that? When I came here, I thought one of the ways to do that, I don't know if it can come from government. Leadership has to come from the private sector, and leadership from finance capital. They have to be willing to take those risks and invest in new businesses. And so anyway, I mean,
I think that's true. I think there are some examples of other, because it's not just oil, right? Oil is the most prominent example, but whenever there's sort of one extractive resource that is by far the most profitable, it tends to do this, right? The resource curves a bunch of different countries. But I do think there are models of countries that have done it better than we have. So Norway and Australia would probably be the two I would point to. And neither of them is perfect, but they have a more diverse economy and seem to have done a better job, particularly Norway, of reinvesting the wealth that came out of the oil companies or whatever the resource was. I think you're right. I think the other key point of that is oil, and look, we saw this obviously most prominently with VECO. They captured the Alaskan political system for a long time. Right. And you could argue about whether or not they still do. They have a lot of influence. And when you're setting up a tax structure, for example, there have been times in Alaska's political history where they're basically represented at both sides of the table, right? I mean, they have enough influence that we are supposed to do arm's length negotiations with these oil companies at times. You're right, there are friends and neighbors, but it's also a business transaction. And their headquarters is in BP's headquarters is in England, like you said, and so, but we are a small state with small population, and an oil company can drop $10 or $20 million here and fundamentally change the political structure of our state, and they have at times. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens when that is hopefully no longer the case.
Sure. In the same vein, the oil in Alaska segment, I do think that this will kind of get you guys to disagree a little bit, is the climate change and oil's effect on the climate, potentially. Alaska is the only Arctic state in the nation, as we all know, and we see the effects of climate change faster than anyone else in the union. How do Alaskans reconcile our dependence on oil and our responsibility to the environment?
Start with Professor.
Yeah, well, I mean, I honestly, I'm not a scientist. I don't know what to think about, the whole science of climate change. I read the East Anglia scandal. I read the emails that somebody posted and showed that there was really, academic malfeasance going on there, and that they were cooking the books to try. And you could see how the incentives were aligned to really falsify the conclusions. So that really bothered me, and I haven't gotten over that one. I was generally open and to the possibility that human influence is causing global warming and climate change and all that stuff. But after that, I decided I don't think I really want to accept everything that I hear from them hook, line, and sinker. Now, the fact that people are saying that that it is affecting Alaska in tangible ways, and that perversely it actually might even help us, because we could have deep water ports built on the North Slope, which would really help us. If we could ship natural gas from a deep water port on the North Slope, that means we could keep it in the ground when the price is low and ship it out when the price is high, and maximize our return on investing in natural gas extraction up there. So maybe it'll help us and open up those ports for us, and also help in intercontinental trade. I will say that I'm involved with, all right, this isn't public, but it will be soon. I'm sort of involved in the Niskanen Center. I'm writing for them. They're trying to kind of save the Republican Party from itself, and they are a very pro-climate change policy institute in Washington, D.C. And so those good people over there are engaged in dialogue. They have a different approach. It's more free market, and I suppose I'd be open to that. And I'm open to the possibility that humans are having a significant effect on climate change. I just, after that, I've seen that fraud and a few others. I've not been ready to just take anybody's word for it. So there you have it.
So
FD, take your best shot.
Sure, climate change is real, and it's being caused by humans, and it's not particularly advanced science. There was a climatologist I heard speak a couple nights ago who said this is basically middle school science, and the vast majority of scientists all over the world have accepted this at this point. His name is Brian, I think it's Brett Schneider, I can't pronounce his last name, but his Twitter is @climate49 or climatologist49. I really recommend people will follow him. He's a climatologist here in Alaska. And it is the case that here in Alaska, we can see the effects of climate change much more directly than a lot of other places, right?
Sure.
We have wildfires this summer. We have salmon dying in our rivers that they think might be related to it. We have melting permafrost. I mean, you have indigenous records where people are saying, we can tell that things are noticeably warmer now than they were not too long ago. And Professor Nabors is right that in the short term, it might be the case, or medium term, might be the case that there are some economic benefits to Alaska. But, I mean, you can't eat money, right? And at the end of the day, if we destroy and we contribute to the destruction of the entire world's climate, and all the disruption that comes from that, and the trillions of dollars that will come from that, that is something that I don't think we can live with. And so it gets back to your earlier question. How do we, as Alaskans, when we know we are contributing to this problem, how do we stop contributing? And part of it is at the local level, you can do things like the Climate Action Plan, but ultimately the biggest impact that Alaska could have would be to send 2 senators to the US Senate that are not climate change deniers. We send one, we have another one where I think the jury is still out. To do that, we have to diversify our economy. Oil cannot, the oil is, I'll put it this way, whenever there's an issue where they need to have somebody be moderate, there's only one senator anybody calls, okay? And so what was I saying? We need to diversify the economy so that we are not so dependent on oil. The other thing is, alternative energy is rapidly developing, right? We are sitting on an asset that might rapidly decrease in value very soon. We don't know when, but there's a chance that the world that has almost every major political party in the entire world has accepted the human causal relationship to climate change. The Republican Party in the United States is the only major party that seems to deny it, at least in the Democratic world, right? And they, when the rest of the world says, no, we are for real moving away from fossil fuels, that could significantly impact our asset. So we need to be trying to diversify, not only because it's the right thing to do, not only because of the perverse effects that Professor Nabors talked about, having oil be our only major economic force, but also because it'll free us politically to start having some hard conversations, whether they're market-based or regulatory-based, about reducing overall carbon emissions in the country. And that, by its nature, is going to reduce the amount of oil that people are going to want, and that's going to harm our bottom line if we do not diversify our economy.
So in the short term, should Alaskan policymakers aim to incentivize oil companies to come up here, or what?
Yeah, I would say yes with natural gas. With oil, it's a little bit harder. I mean, our economy right now is so dependent on oil that there's no question in the short and even to medium term that we have to have oil companies be a major part of our economy.
So let's take that point, and it's kind of the root of my question. How do you reconcile those two? How can you?
Yeah.
You said short and medium term.
Yeah.
We should create policy that incentivizes at least natural gas.
Yeah.
Still fossil fuel.
Right.
Can it be reconciled? Is it something that has to be? We just have to bite the bullet and preach that we fight for climate change initiatives while making investments in fossil fuels, or?
I think at the local and state level, we can do things to reduce our own carbon output, and we are doing things like converting to LED. Yeah. At the national level, there hasn't been a statewide candidate yet that's been able to run on a platform of, no, we are for real going to take action on climate change and win. And that means local and state politicians have to work to diversify the economy so we can eventually get there. Because right now it is actually the case that is, if you the Green New Deal, if you did something like that, it would devastate our economy. Sure. So we have to build an economy that wouldn't be devastated by that, or we have to find, put the New Deal and the Green New Deal and make sure that Alaska is extremely well compensated so that we can get through the transition period.
From the federal government, I assume.
Yeah.
During that transition, how do you feel about a federal subsidy of Alaska to curb climate change, if that's a fair way to put what you just said?
I like economic incentives. I like using honey, not vinegar. It's a more effective way of getting stuff done. Then you don't have bitter political campaigns over whose pound of flesh is going to have to pay for this policy. That's why I like the Niskanen Center's approach, and you might too. See, I'm nudging you towards the Republican side of things.
Aren't they more like libertarian, Niskanen Center?
Yeah, they are. Yeah. I mean,
I don't think the Republican Party is libertarian anymore, but that would be a different conversation.
Well, I know, but that's what they're trying to.
Right.
Yeah, these are trying to sort of reform the Republican Party from within.
Sure.
But they do take climate. I mean, they left Cato because of their differences of opinion with them on such things like climate, because they said, "Hey, climate change is real.
Sure.
We got to." And we got to do something about it. And true to libertarian principles, we need to come up with solutions that use incentives, market-based incentives, and that kind of thing. So that's what they really want to work on. And I would be, and I would be in favor of that, not simply because, of the because it's more effective. I mean, if you appeal to people's self-interest, if you can find ways to appeal to people's self-interest,
but how do you do that?
You have a better.
I mean, you have to. There's an external cost associated with carbon output. So how do you build that price into any kind of market?
Right. Well, I think the carbon tax system that they had proposed was one. I mean, in a sense, I mean that idea was a really nice idea.
Sure.
And it never got implemented, but I mean, it was a creative way of using financial incentives
Sure.
to get people to to mine their carbon emissions. And that is a way of kind of using market forces in your favor. And I think that's much better.
You're saying market forces, but it would have to be the government that restructured the market in order to do
I
that.
hear what you're saying. Yeah, I know.
Or at least provide the subsidy.
So please, entrepreneurs, we need entrepreneurs to start inventing stuff
Sure.
that takes oil out of the game.
But what you just said, I mean, if you take oil out of the game, where does that leave Alaska?
Well, how about carbon capture?
I have an idea. How about you triple the funding to the University of Alaska at Anchorage?
I agree.
We will research it, discover that,
Sure.
and then we'll make oil go away, and we'll become fabulously wealthy, and everybody will be happy.
When I was in grad school, they did a congressional simulation where I played the congressperson from Alaska, which is kind of funny. And the bill that I got through, and this was 10 years ago, would have opened ANWR and then taken all of the revenue and put it into an Arctic Energy Research Center at the University of Alaska, like billions of dollars.
Oh, geez.
And right, and
Please.
and I got it passed because it was just a.
Well, actually, I mean, let's. Do you mind if we segue into this for a second?
Go ahead, yeah.
Because actually, I'm serious. We're about to start producing oil again. I mean, the spigot's going to come back on. We think, right? I mean,
What do you mean? It's already on.
Well, I know, but I mean, the number of barrels of oil per day is going to start rising.
I mean,
again,
maybe
we think.
Sean Parnell told us we'd have $1 million.
2 years, 3 years. Well, we've had a bunch of permitting and exploration, and they're going to hopefully go into production in a couple of years or 3 years. If that happens, I would like a pledge from you, Mr. Politician, that you will do everything you can to this time to have a share of the oil revenue go into university endowment.
Like University of Texas.
Like University of Texas. Sure. Absolutely.
I would absolutely.
That has been killing us.
Yeah.
You know, our endowment is $200 million for this university. You know what the University of Texas is? $26 billion.
Yeah.
And, you know, our permit fund, not all of it went into that. We didn't really set money aside for the university. If we had done that, our university wouldn't be going through this crisis right now.
I would absolutely agree to that. But we need people on the conservative side of the aisle to agree to a restructuring of production taxes, because even though we are getting more barrels, we are getting far less revenue per barrel than we got, under ACEs or even before that. Mm-hmm. So, and we're going to get even less because these new fields are taxed in a different way, where at some point we're actually paying them to I mean, we still get our royalty share, but we are not getting enough revenue from this oil. So I would absolutely commit to that. You need to commit to allowing us to restructure our oil tax system so that Alaskans get a fair share.
I'll shake on that.
Yeah. Even though neither of us have any real direct influence on this, at least not right now.
No, not right now.
Maybe
someday.
In the future. Maybe in the future. I'm glad you brought the PFD though, because I was actually going to segue into our next segment, which is the topic of universal basic income. It's been raised on the presidential campaign, especially with the rise of Andrew Yang. I want to get you guys' thoughts on that. Has the PFD been a curse? Yes, the PFD, front dividend, for those that don't know. Has it been a curse for this state as far as politics goes? Because it's kind of holding up our legislature right now. And would it be wise to implement it on the national level? Professor Nabors.
Yeah, well, PFD has been very effective in rounding up political support from the people to keep on pulling oil out of the ground. I mean, essentially, PFD has bought votes from the people of Alaska to continue with oil exploration and production, and to continue to depend on oil. So in a way, it's kind of, I mean, I'm not in political office right now, so I can afford to use inflammatory language. In a way, it's kind of like this massive bribe. You keep voting to support, this line of policy, and we'll keep paying these PFDs. So I think I'm neither judging that it's good or bad in this way, but I'm saying it was politically effective in that sense. In terms of what it does for the people of Alaska, I'm not so sure that it really has helped us that much, because my guess is it's probably driven costs up, prices up. So that money, even though it's gone right into people's pockets, I suspect that it is also across the board inflated prices. And so I think that the net value, the real value of PFD dividend has probably been less than what it might otherwise be.
I disagree with that for a couple of reasons. There was an ICER study done not too long ago, which I'm sure Professor Nabors is familiar with, that indicated that the PFD was an extremely effective policy at reducing sort of the most abject poverty. And here in Anchorage, I remember a couple years ago, I was at this homelessness community meeting, and I was talking with some of our policy experts there, and they said that October and November are usually the time when the number of people experiencing homelessness on our street is the least, because they get the PFD and they use it to stay in an apartment or at someone's house as long as they can, right? So I think it's been a very effective policy and a net positive for the state. I think UBI could be an effective policy nationwide. I think it's funny when people, so Mr. Nabors' position is very much diametrically opposed to our current governor and some of his supporters in the Valley, who are conservatives, but also huge supporters of the PFD.
Yeah.
And when you tell them the PFD is a form of UBI, they hit the roof. They say, no, it can't be, because they know that UBI is socialism and they hate socialism. They love the PFD, ergo they cannot be the same thing.
UBI is not. It's not socialism.
Well, so
they think so.
No, I think it is. I think we have made a disagreement of what socialism is.
Charles Murray is a libertarian. He's been in favor of UBI for years.
Doesn't mean it's not socialism. I mean, so if you're socializing some of the wealth and then redistributing among people. But regardless, I mean, the knock on the PFD is not that it's not universal or income. It's that it's not basic. It's not enough to really meet the needs of the UBI. But where I think I agree with Professor Nabors is that it has had a distortionate effect on the Alaskan political system, because there was a very clear path that Governor Dunleavy took, which was you could espouse conservatism and then use populism essentially and say, I'm going to increase the size of your PFD, and thereby build this coalition, especially if you aren't challenged on whether or not your budget numbers actually, meet up. And during the 2018 election, for whatever reason, he was not seriously challenged on the fact that his budget numbers were impossible. They were mathematically impossible, and everybody knew it. Everybody who followed the politics closely knew it. And so he was able to win election, but now we see this incredible, chaos at the state level because he promised things that are fundamentally impossible, right? And so in that sense, it's not so much the PFD program's the problem. It's that, I'd say two things. One is that we dropped the income tax when we dropped the PFD. And that was something that Governor Hammond was opposed to. And I think that has caused a lot of problems. And then second, it's the sort of venal nature of politicians. I think politicians have abused this program, even though the program itself, I think, could have worked in a better way and does work in a good way.
Don't you think it's a little inevitable that it will be used politically? You're giving people directly money.
Yeah, so, I mean, I would say it's very similar to tax cuts at the federal level, where the Republican Party has promised massive tax cuts over and over and over, then pretended like they paid for themselves, and thereby been able to, as you said, buy votes, right? And I think there is that similarity, and that's unfortunate, but it doesn't mean that the idea of the PFD is itself, fundamentally flawed to me.
Sure, and my question is, as far as UBI is concerned, is if UBI was instated, wouldn't it create that constituent class that the PFD created, to where politicians will start using UBI and increasing your UBI as a way of buying votes or of...
There was a really good article published, I think it was in Vox, by a young woman named Robin Sundley last week, exploring this issue, which was, she's a supporter of UBI, as am I. And I know some folks that were supported at the national level. And what we've learned in the last year or two in Alaska is that there is clearly this avenue for populist politicians to use this program, and or just this distortionate nature. And that the people who, UBI is not a new concept, but Alaska is kind of the only real example of it in the United States. And so I think there's a lot of lessons being learned right now about what's happening in Alaska, and people that want to craft a UBI policy nationally have to take what's happening in Alaska into account and have to try to learn.
Some of them have visited here to study what we've been doing and some of the problems that Chris Hughes, who was one of the co-founders of Facebook, was here and he is. This is where politics sometimes makes strange bedfellows.
Yep.
And he's on the progressive left. Charles Murray is known as a libertarian. They're both UBI fans, and I think if we could replace a lot of programs with UBI, what that does is it restores choice to citizens, and so I like that, and I like the fact that by providing people with a basic livable income, that they don't have to fill out all these forms, and all of the help that they might need is conditional and all of that. So this is also this idea once entered the political debate as negative income tax nationally, and I actually I would like to experiment a little bit with this and see if this works better. I hate the idea of and this is where you really see my libertarianism shine. I hate the idea that people always are beholden to bureaucrats and red tape and all of that to try to make ends meet and that gives these bureaucrats power over their lives and dumb forms and errors in the system, which happens all the time. So anyway, I that's why I would love to experiment with that idea.
But would you? So if UBI was implemented, would you cut other social programs in lieu of that, or would you keep the same social programs that are already in place?
Yeah, well, I would like to, just in the spirit of the quid pro quo that Mr. Dunbar made just a few months ago, I'm going to return the favor and say, hey, you shut down a few programs, let's go UBI, let's replace it with you, and let's replace those programs in equal amounts of funding. You follow my drift? So, I would like to see that.
If we had universal health care, a lot of these programs would get a lot less expensive and a lot less complicated. So that would be one way to help you get there. Have Medicare for all or something equivalent to that. And you don't have to fill out a bunch of forms and prove that you're at this income level or prove this or that. It's just like places like Japan, Germany, Australia, where I'm a citizen, so I can have universal health care. Then we can lower overall costs and we can use those savings to have a UBI. How about that?
Is this show going to be an hour? Because I think now we have something to really find out.
It's probably going to be an hour. I have one more question, but I do want to stay on the topic of UBI and balancing out the equation as far as because I think it could be looked at as a libertarian topic and it could be looked at as a socialist topic depending on what other social programs the country has if it's on a national level.
Sure.
I think what Alaska has right now is leans more towards the socialist side because we have a very bloated state government.
False. No, it's false. Compared to almost every other developed country in the world, we actually have very little social services. So
the state of Alaska particularly.
The United States as a whole, and the state of Alaska as a political entity in that, where we don't have particularly. Look, I worked at Alaska Legal Services. It is not easy to be on food stamps or to be on Medicaid. You're absolutely right. You have to deal with these bureaucrats that have control over your life. And you have to, and with things like food stamps, you're time barred. You have 3 months, and then some people are kicked off. So we actually do not have a super generous welfare state in this state or in the United States. But the libertarians have convinced a lot of people, by shifting the Overton window, that actually there's this huge entitlement class. That's actually not the case. It's very hard to sort of live on the equivalent of welfare in this state or anywhere else. So and the idea we have a bloated state government, adjusted for inflation, we spend less per capita now than we have at any point since the 1980s. So I don't think that's the case either. Of course, it is expensive to live in Alaska and have basic services in Alaska, there's no question. But the thing that sets the United States and Alaska apart from the rest of the developed world is we have extremely low taxes. We have very low taxes relative to the rest of the world.
Well, I would first do my cross comparison between Alaska and other states. Instead of Alaska and Sweden, right? I think that's a more fair comparison to make. I do think we spend too much money here, and our state government is too big.
What specifically would you cut?
Well, don't quote me on the number. Don't ask me to quote the numbers, but I've seen the numbers, and the amount of government spending per citizen, per resident in the state, I think is very high compared to other states, not to Sweden, but to other states. The reason for that is that when the state of Alaska was admitted to the Union, we had this massive amount of land, small population. We set up the state to basically to fund and administer government from the center to all over. They did put Article 10 into the state constitution, which is there to try to raise maturing communities through pupillage to maturity and then become self-governing independent communities. But, we still are really sustaining communities all across Alaska, including this university, from a central point out into the edges. And that we haven't really yet broken out of that. And I think oil factors very large in that story, why it is. We did it because we could. I think a much better and happier state would see communities that mature and develop and have diversified economies and can support themselves and so on, instead of having all the parts of the state basically lifted up from government services and funding and breaks and PFD dividends and everything coming from a central point. I mean, our university says that I'm part of this system. We have one of the highest rates of dependency on state appropriations in the country, right? And it shouldn't be that way. But why is it? Well, because of the way the system was set up. And all of government, all of state government is kind of like that. I think that's why it's so expensive on a per person basis, as opposed to other states where communities are more self-supporting and they're more frugal as a result. But I think that's what I would like us to get to. I think overall we would be far more prosperous. Our economy would be far more diversified if we no longer expect the state to kind of do that job of lifting everybody up.
But the state has always been the entity, and I think is the only realistic entity in which to do that sort of ingathering and then redistribution. And you say like a centralized point. I think people hear that and they think it's Anchorage or Juneau. But actually the wealth of this state is created mostly in rural Alaska. It comes from the North Slope, it comes from the Red Dog Mine, it comes from the fish that are along the coast. Right. So, I mean, another model is the wealth stays there and doesn't come to Anchorage or doesn't go to Juneau. The folks at the North Slope fully control the oil and are able to buy and sell it and have property taxes and all the rest. But I don't think that was really an equitable model either, because it's arbitrary whether you happen to be sitting on a plot of land that has a huge amount of oil or whether you don't. And so we created a state constitution, and we use things like ANCSA with the 7I funds that do help sort of bring in and redistribute that wealth. And I think it's sort of an inescapable model when you have a state with this kind of population, with these kind of resources, and with this kind of geographic challenge, right? But to get to your point about, what could we do to maybe reduce, maybe this was your point, some dependence on the oil and some dependence on the extraction. Part of it is we are the only state in the country without any kind of broad-based tax, right? We're the only state where that's the case. Forget comparing us to Sweden, compare us to Texas. If we had an oil system, and they have either a sales tax or an income tax. You know more about Texas than I do. They have a sales tax, right? Yeah. I prefer an income tax because I think sales taxes are a little bit more aggressive.
I'm with you. I agree.
Either way, you have to be able to capture more of the wealth and then and also have skin in the game, right? Alaskans.
The skin in the game argument is a compelling one. I think that's the most compelling one.
Yeah, and this was. Governor Hammond, the last Republican my parents ever voted for, was a visionary in a lot of ways. He opposed getting rid of the income tax, and eventually he went along with it. But I think his insight was we'd have the PFD that would basically hold Alaskans harmless. And then the folks that came in to work on the North Slope, to come wherever, they would pay an income tax. And we would pay some small income tax as well. And in that way, you wouldn't have this fundamental break that you've seen with a lot of people between the government and the services provided and, like you were saying, the sort of the fact that I am myself contributing to it, right? That I have some financial incentives to.
Yeah.
Maybe it's to reduce costs. I actually don't think it would be. When you put it in front of people, like say where I'm from in Cordova, would you rather have an income tax or a ferry system? I think most people would say I'd be willing to pay an income tax that meant I had a ferry system.
Yeah.
Because without the ferry system, my small rural community cannot function. And that's the case with a lot of places in Alaska where there are these programs. The school, where I lived in Eagle, the school is the center of the community. And that's the case for a lot of villages. If you destroy state support for the schools, some of these villages will actually wither and die and go away. And I know that some folks that live on the road system say, well, so be it, they shouldn't live out there. But I think that gets to something that's fundamental about the soul of the state of Alaska. And rural communities are very much a part of that.
No, I understand. So let me, I want to debate with you about, whether or not we should cut those schools in those communities. What I'd like to debate is how do we get to a vision that I think we could both get behind. What I would like to see the state of, Lord willing, the river don't rise. I'm still here. We're both here for years to come, and hopefully we can have some influence in this debate. But what I would like to see Alaska become is the richest, freest, and also because we missed a lot of the harshest lessons of the Industrial Revolution, we can still be the greenest state of the union. I mean, we ought to be able to teach the rest of the world how to live in the Arctic and thrive and prosper while living and doing so without harming our environment, but living together with it, and have a population here that is numerous, but it's not overwhelming the because we can fit them here, but we're also preserving the beauty of this place and not damaging it. Well, we could have 50 million people here and not even put a dent in this. But seriously, that is how I'd like to. We are right in the middle of international trade routes, right in the middle of fiber lines that meet offshores that connect the Americas, Asia, and Europe. I mean, there is a ton that we ought to be able to do with this place economically. That's what I would like to get to. And I would like to get to a point where our communities are vibrant, thriving economically. And the debate is not going to be about whether or not the state should lift up these rural school systems because they're the soul of the state, and whether or not we should cut them or make this expense, but rather have communities that are able to support them on their own because they're wealthy, happy, prosperous, and self-governing. And that's where I think and so the question ought to be, I don't like the debate about, should we, cut all these people off of the state government? It's and this person's a demon and a devil because they want to cut them off, and then this person is profligate and wants to waste the public treasury. No, let's start with the vision and then figure out how do we get there? Because I think a lot of people like that vision of our state exporting republicanism and trade and wealth back to the lower 48 and show how citizens, we are so hyper diverse here in Anchorage, and we could show the rest of the country how we can be prosperous, thriving, patriotic American citizens. We want that, don't we?
I don't disagree with a lot of what you said in theory. In practice, the way it's worked in Alaska, I'll say one thing. It doesn't really matter whether or not you want to support those rural schools. There's a constitutional duty to do so, right? And it's been litigated. You have to constitutionally fund those rural schools, right? I would say also, I just want to make sure we bring it up before we close here.
Sure.
When you're talking about the greenest state, and you're talking about the state where we have self-governing bodies, we know it can be done because it was done by the indigenous people here for 10,000 years.
Right.
So I think the indigenous community has to be a key part of that vision. The problem is now, it is, but there are
the native corporations.
Well, native corporations are part of it, but there's also the tribal entities, and a lot of folks who feel that some of the extractive industries are counter to what they see as the long-term vision of the state, right? And so that gets back to diversifying away from some of those extractive industries too. But again, I mean, the idea that we should be prosperous, the idea that we should be largely self-governing, the idea that people shouldn't be completely reliant on the state. I don't think you're going to get much pushback on any of that. But the practical reality on the ground right now in a lot of rural communities is that the state has been the primary funder of the schools, for example. They have a constitutional duty to do so. And that needs to continue if we want to have a functioning state, because ultimately what you're talking about is a lot of really acute political tension if you try to do what the governor just tried to do, which was very quickly devastate all of those communities. Whether or not that was his intention, I don't think it was. Some people think he's like actually trying to actively depopulate the state. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I just think that his particular vision is driven by something fundamentally counter to the way the state was originally structured and the way the constitutional law of the state exists. And in the future, again,
Of course, that policy debate shouldn't be the be-all and end-all of the legislative session. I mean, we should be thinking about that long-term vision and thinking about what policy steps we need to take to get there.
Yeah.
So that we're not just debating about. That's why I'm saying I want to get away from. I want to solve that policy difference of agree. Get that taken care of, and then let's move to how to improve our state. Because frankly, our growth has been pathetic. We have fallen so short of where we should be as a state. And we don't look ourselves in the mirror enough and say that we have fallen short and we need to improve. Because we are not using all the assets that we have here
I didn't agree
with that.
I didn't agree with everything Governor Bill Walker did or the way he did it. And I think he made some pretty key mistakes politically. But I think he was willing to have that conversation you're talking about now. And he was trying to. And I'm hoping that Governor Kevin Meyer will be too.
I thought Walker, regardless of what you like or don't like about his policy solutions, the man had guts.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
He actually tried to.
Right, and I, like I said, I didn't share all those same political beliefs that he did, but I mean, his obsession in life was to try to build a natural gas pipeline. Yeah. And you could agree whether or not that was the right policy, but I think it fits into what you're talking about. That was what he wanted to accomplish. He wanted to do something that would have lasted longer than just the taps, right? Yeah. And he was willing to make some really tough political calls to try to get us somewhere near a balanced budget. Yeah. Unfortunately, there was obviously, what happened there.
Yeah.
Well, we found something to argue about. Yeah. Although I'm still not sure how far apart we are.
Yeah, I definitely think we found something. UBI, well, it just points to the importance of direct subsidies to the populace and how that can affect politics. And I think that we have to look at that if we start to talk about implementing UBI on a national level, how that will affect our politics. And it's not going to stay at a current rate. It's probably going to move, increase faster than the rate of inflation, knowing politics and people wanting to get elected.
Maybe. I mean, Social Security didn't, though. I mean, Social Security now
Social Security is also insolvent, so I don't think we should compare it to.
Social Security is not insolvent. What's insolvent is the fact that we rated it and we, again, passed these huge tax cuts. Anyway, Medicare and Medicaid has much more problems than Social Security, and that's because of dramatic healthcare inflation.
Sure.
You are like Bill Clinton that you never turn it off. You love it. He's a policy wonk.
I am, of course I am.
Bill Clinton was a policy wonk.
Well, I don't know if that's
And I'll point this out to our viewing audience that he also studied in Washington D.C. undergrad, then went to Yale Law.
This is all true. But I actually do turn it off. When I'm playing basketball with Mike. That's my happy place.
It's channeled into a different direction.
You're a Sacramento Kings fan, aren't you?
No, Golden State Warriors.
Sorry.
No, I got nothing against the Kings. I was just, my extended family is originally from the Bay Area, so I've been a Warriors fan back before they were good. Yeah. It's back in the We Believe days, and before that too.
Davis.
Yeah.
Well, I'll leave you with something. You know that God wears pinstripes. That is a fact. It's in the Bible.
I'm more of an A's fan myself. To be honest, I don't.
Minor league team, and they keep sending us players.
Yeah,
it's fantastic.
Best team money can buy.
That's the Red Sox.
Yeah, fair enough.
But except they're not the best.
Well, this has been good. It's been a good podcast, and just wrapping things up. I want to ask the final question, which is something that we'll ask all of our guests: is how can we, in this political climate, come together in a bipartisan manner like we did today and have a good conversation that leads to some promises being made, some deals being made on going forward. We asked Professor Nabors this yesterday. But
So you go
we can
first.
start with
Okay.
today.
I feel like my answer will probably not bring us closer together, but that's okay. I think that at the local level, we've actually done a pretty good job of having this kind of bipartisanship. At the local level here in Anchorage, I think we've accomplished a lot, and I don't really care if a proposal comes from Crystal Kennedy, who's a conservative, or Austin Quinn Davidson, who's a progressive. I think we've done a lot of work, and there's no letter next to your name. At the state level, actually, we have a remarkable amount of bipartisan. We have a bipartisan coalition right now. The divide at the state level is actually not between Democrat and Republican. It's basically between the people that went to Juneau and whatever you call the people that went to Wasilla, right, when we had the two different competing sessions. And there were Republicans, well, there were only Republicans in Wasilla, but there were Republicans and Democrats in Juneau. I think the way to reduce partisanship, a couple things. I think you have to reduce, and this is where Professor Nabors, I think, will disagree. You have to reduce some of the counter-majoritarian structures of our country. So at the national level, we have this rampant partisanship. And I think in particular, you have to reduce the amount of money in politics, and you have to reduce income inequality. All of those things are related. So if you survey American people right now, they think income inequality, if you measure the Gini coefficient, is right about here. And they think, and you ask them, what should it be? And they say it should be right about here. But the actual reality in the world is that it's here. It's the highest it's been since the 1920s, and it creates a ton of problems and pathologies in our political discourse. And when you have, again, I don't want to be too partisan, but if you have a party that's committed to that sort of vision of the country that's so out of step with the vast majority of people, you're going to lead to a politics of dishonesty and a politics of that sort of is the naked the naked use of power, exercise of power. And you're going to destroy a lot of norms, okay? To do that, if you believe that you are right and your policy preferences are so out of whack with what the majority of people want, you're going to start doing things like, for example, using the filibuster all the time. And the clearest example, I think, of where this partisanship has taken us is the case of Merrick Garland, right? And Mitch McConnell basically saying, I won't even give your Supreme Court justice, your potential Supreme Court justice, a hearing, right? And in so doing, capturing this seat for the Republican Party, this seat, and flipping the Supreme Court. So before I came here today, I was reading up on, there's now a sort of mainstream political discourse in the Democratic Party about we need to, quote unquote, unpack the court. The court has been packed by the Republican Party, and we need to unpack it. So if a Democrat wins the presidency and we take the Senate, I think you will see serious calls to increase the size of the Supreme Court, to unpack the packing that's been done the last several cycles predominantly by Mitch McConnell, right? So that to me, getting rid of some of those counter-majoritarian forces, bringing the Republican Party more in line with the policy preferences of the rest of the country, I think that will lead to a lot more bipartisanship. But right now, you have a National Republican Party, and again, this is where Professor Nabors and I probably disagree. You have a National Republican Party that is careened so far out of the mainstream that none of their policy preferences are actually held by almost any of the majority of the people in the country. And when that's the case, bipartisanship, when you were saying Democrats need to move closer to the Republicans, I think that is very hard to achieve and not necessarily what should happen. So I think, again, you need to reduce the impact of money in politics. You need to bring the Republican Party closer to where the mainstream of the American people are, and you need to reduce income inequality. In so doing, you will help heal the divide of partisanship at the national level. At the state level and the local level, it's a little bit less bad.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
There's a lot there. We can do
No more time for me.
Yeah, we can do another podcast on that wrap-up, but last words, Professor Nabors, it's all yours.
He's wrong about everything.
That's fine.
No, I appreciate those remarks. I mean, I would just say very briefly that I think both parties are in serious trouble, both of them. And the problem, I mean, what I just heard sounds like what I also hear from those who incline left, which is that the way to solve the problem in our civil discourse is for people on the right to basically give up and join us.
Or to become less radical.
Or
I'd say
to
that.
become more like us.
Come a
is to
little bit
agree
more
with
towards the
us.
center. I mean, the same
Right,
pressure that was.
I'm talking now, sir. See, that's the problem.
There's no real political left in this country. There's a centrist and there's a right.
But the solution, the solution, what I just heard as you explain it, is basically for people who are on the right to come to the left, and that's how you solve bipartisanship.
Come closer to the center.
Yeah, but look, I mean, the left has been our political spectrum in this country. If you want to look at left and right, has been going left for a while. And so, what essentially you're saying is, people who are on the right, you need to run to the left as fast as we do. And that's how you solve bipartisanship. No, what we mean by bipartisanship, which I understand to mean by his question, is that we continue to be in principle disagreement. We're able to figure out where we have common ground, and we're able to talk to each other and maybe try to sway each other some. The problem is that the lack of that in the political spaces, and the lack of civility. What I would say, yeah, he's etching, you all realize that. But there is a big problem in your party that I see nationally, not in Alaska, but nationally, it is a problem but I won't exempt the Republican Party from criticism. I mean, I've been a registered independent for the longest time, and that recently changed. Because I want to help clean things up, and I've been a registered independent for years.
Can I ask one question before we wrap up?
It's a hell of a time for me to become a Republican, right?
Yeah.
And when Trump, because I'm a never Trumper. I didn't vote for him. I never will. But I want to help clean things up, and that's why I want to work with an Niskanen Center.
So as the country becomes more diverse demographically, it appears that the policy preferences of the electorate is becoming, as you would say, sort of further to the left. So my question is, the Republican Party that is ostensibly committed to both capitalism and democracy, if it becomes the case that they cannot be committed to their current vision of capitalism, do you think they'll give up that vision of capitalism, or they'll give up the democratic impulse? Because we have things like gerrymandering, for example, the way that was used in North Carolina, the way that it's used in Wisconsin. We have things like the filibuster. We have things like the Electoral College that will again and again frustrate the Democratic majority, and I say little d Democratic majority. Do you think the Republicans will double down on those kind of counter-majoritarian strictures, or do you think they will change their sort of policy preferences?
Well, I think that is a great question for our next episode.
I'm gonna have to. I'll chew on that one for us.
But
we'll come back.
But we are definitely approaching an hour in this podcast, so we gotta wrap things up. But we do appreciate you guys sitting down, and I will be more than happy to sit down with you guys again to pick up that question for us. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.